All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and supported entirely by listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. So if you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused podcasts and radio shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the great shows in our network. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and it feels so good to be back on the main feed again. As y'all know, we were really hustling our asses off at the end of last year. Then the world got turned upside down yet again with a major COVID surge. So Jules and I decided to, take that cue to finally shut things down, call it a wrap on season 4 of the show, and get some much needed rest. Now, of course, when I say rest, I'm putting that in air quotes because, frankly, I forgot what rest looks like, and I know it's the same for many of you, but still, after our longest and most ambitious season of the show to date, we needed to step away, get our houses and other jobs in order, and, start scheming for season 5 of the show. Now, for any of y'all who have been just jonesing for more working people style content while we've been on break and haven't known where to look, I wanted to remind y'all that you should be checking out the work that we're doing every week over at the Real News Network, because I and a whole gang of amazing staff and freelancers have been working our butts off to lift up workers' voices and shine a light on important struggles going on around the U.S. and beyond. In, just the last month and a half that we've been on break, I've done, video and podcast interviews for the Real News with Amy's Kitchen production plant workers, Hollywood animators who are fighting for a fair contract. I spoke with Christina Lujan, one of the workers who makes ice cream cakes at the John Denaire plant in Santa Fe Springs, California, and have been on strike since November. I got to speak with Israel Cervantes, one of the labor leaders behind the incredible union victory for Mexican auto workers at the General Motors plant in Silao. And, of course, I spoke with retired railroad worker Jeff Kurtz about the truly awful situation that railroad workers at BNSF Railway are in right now. And you guys got to hear the audio of that interview here on the Working People feed. So my point is, we're doing lots of cool shit and lots of important coverage over at the Real News. So if you haven't checked out the great podcasts, YouTube shows, and text articles that we're publishing over there, you should definitely fix that. And also, of course, even though we haven't been putting out new episodes on the public feed, we've still been posting bonus episodes for our amazing Working People subscribers over on the Patreon feed. And we've got lots more coming your way. As you guys know, as I say all the time on the show, the single best thing that you can do to support the work that we're doing here at Working People so we can keep growing and keep bringing y'all more important conversations with workers and organizers is to become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. All you got to do is head over to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Smash that subscribe button and you will immediately get access to all the awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published over the years. And if you want to support the show, but you're not ready to become a Patreon subscriber just yet, then please leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Share these episodes on your social media and share them with your coworkers, your friends, and your family members. That's a really great way to help us grow, even if you don't want to become a Patreon subscriber just yet. All right. So with all that out of the way, I did want to say that we are not officially back from break just yet, but we are just about there. Now, we'll have a whole season 5 opener coming your way very, very soon. And again, we are so excited to get back to bringing y'all new episodes every week. But before we get there, we wanted to share this big, exciting, special episode with y'all that we've been working on for a little while. And it really is special to me, and I hope that you guys feel the same. So late last year, I had the honor of getting to speak to a wonderful class at Tulane University. And the class was called Introduction to Podcasting and Social Justice, taught by none other than the amazing Dr. Billy Saas, whom you all may know as the co-host and producer of the podcast Money on the Left, and the co-founder and co-director of the Money on the Left Editorial Collective. Now, I feel like there's a good deal of crossover between working people audiences and Money on the Left audiences. But, you know, if you guys haven't checked out Money on the Left, you absolutely should, especially if, like me, like yours truly, you are fascinated in, you know, the politics and history of money, and you're interested in questions about modern monetary theory, and you frankly have no idea where to start learning more about them. So Money on the Left is a great place to start. And, you know, from the beginning, Money on the Left has been a really, I think, informative and beautifully collaborative project that Billy has worked on together with his fellow co-founders, Scott Ferguson and Maximilian Seychaux. And, you know, the Money on the Left Collective is one of the things I love about them, is that they also support and collaborate with 2 other great shows. One that's called Superstructure with Natalie Taub, Will Beeman, and Max Seychaux, as well as Medium Femme with Charlotte Tavon and Natalie Taub. And you can find all of their great work at moneyontheleft.org. And as always, we've included links in the show notes so you guys know where to find them. So, you know, I honestly couldn't be more grateful to Billy for inviting me to come and speak to his class. I mean, it will never not be surreal to me that people, you know, want me to come and give talks on the things that I'm passionate about. But this was, you know, especially surreal because, as Billy and I, you know, discuss later in this episode, we were, you know, there putting our little podcast together years ago when a lot of people were just finding their way to this medium. And now Billy is teaching courses on podcasting. And I mean, I've got a book of interviews with workers coming out in a few months that grew out of my podcasts. It's really wild, man. It's wild, but in, I think, a really beautiful way. So, you know, that's all to say that in the first half of this episode, you're going to hear my conversation with Billy's class, where students asked me about how and why I started Working People and how the show has grown over the years. But, you know, we also have, I think, a really deep and thoughtful conversation about the importance of podcasting as a medium, even with all the different shows that are out there and all the ways that, you know, big names and big outlets and, you know, places like Spotify have come to sort of dominate the scene. And, you know, I share my thoughts about what I think is still good and even revolutionary about podcasting. Then, in the second half of the episode, you'll hear a follow-up conversation that I recorded with Billy and 2 of his amazing students from the class, Sophia Badame and Sophie Harris, where I got to, you know, turn the mic around and talk to them about how the class went, the final projects that they worked on, and what they and their classmates want to do with podcasting. And anyway, I could genuinely gush all day about Billy and his incredible students, but this is a longer episode, so I'll try to wrap things up. All I'll say is that I am so glad that classes like these and professors like Billy exist. And, I wish I could have gotten many more hours to talk with all of the smart, passionate, and caring students who took the course, because they really do give me hope for the future of podcasting and, the future. I know that's a cliche thing to say, but if you talk to, high school and college students, then you'll see what I'm talking about. So from the bottom of my heart, I just wanted to say to Billy and to each and every one of those students who welcomed me to the class, posed these thoughtful questions, and who showed off their production skills by editing the audio for the first half of this episode. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So with that, let's get to the good stuff. Once again, we will be back with season 5 of Working People very, very soon. And we hope you're as excited as we are about that. Until then, without further ado, here's me talking with Professor Billy Saas and his brilliant Tulane students about life, love, and podcasting.
Max Alvarez, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you about your podcast, Working People, and other projects that have come from it. Now, to start our conversation off, can you share a bit about yourself and how you got into podcasting?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, Billy. Thank you to everyone here. It's an honor to be here talking to y'all, and I'm really excited for the conversation. So, yeah, I am Maximilian Alvarez. I am currently the editor-in-chief at the Real News Network here in Baltimore, and I am the host of the show Working People, as you mentioned, which I started myself in graduate school over 3 years ago, and it has kind of blossomed into a project that I'm very proud of. But, I guess a little bit about me, since y'all are kind of going through the college meat grinder, I attended the University of Chicago as an undergraduate and began in 2005. And I remember actually that year was obviously when Hurricane Katrina happened, and we actually were one of the universities that hosted a number of students from Tulane who came and stayed with us. So some of the first friends that I actually had in college were from Tulane, but they departed after the quarter, but I guess there's a little special connection there. But I started college as a pre-med bio major, and I wanted to be an MD my whole life. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. So I took a sharp left turn. My second year in college, I ended up switching my major from biology to Slavic languages and literatures with a focus on Russian literature. And I ended up pursuing that passion through my master's, which I got in Russian literature, and then 2 PhDs at the University of Michigan in history and comparative literature. But, I come from, I'm a first generation Mexican American, one of 4 siblings who also went to college, and we all went off and did different things. But, our family history was always really important to us. It was something that we heard through stories from my dad, my mom, my grandpa, our tios and tias. And so storytelling and knowing kind of where we come from was always a really important part of our upbringing. And, I think about that a lot now, given the work that I do, which is obviously steeped in a deep belief that storytelling is one of our most sort of powerful kind of political tools, and it's one of the most important ways that we learn how to be together on this earth and to share our and understand our common humanity with one another. And that's really kind of how my media work sort of began, right? I guess we can talk about this a little bit more as we go on, but my podcast grew out of our family's experience of losing everything during the Great Recession. And there was so much trauma there, so many complex feelings that we didn't really have the tools to work through. And, I ended up finding in podcasting a really important medium for learning how to tell those stories and for providing a platform for working people to share their own stories with me and with others. And so that's kind of the work that I've committed myself to now. It's what we, in a lot of ways do at The Real News. We don't just cover worker and labor issues, but we have a slate of, weekly shows and text articles, podcasts, YouTube shows, an incredible staff that produces great investigative work on the violence and victims of the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, political struggles, people fighting for a better world around the globe. It's important work, and I'm very honored and fortunate to be able to do it.
Yeah, so kind of going off of that, like you said, your family was kind of your inspiration, but there are so many important social issues that need attention today, and we were wondering what drove you to make a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class specifically.
Like I said, the project of Working People was a deeply personal one. And, I won't necessarily rehash like the whole long story. I mean, I've told it on the show a number of times, and I won't bore everyone here, but the SparkNotes version is, as I mentioned before, like millions and millions of others. Our family, lost everything in the Great Recession. And our family, both sides of my family, as I said, growing up, we always heard about the struggles from my mom's side and my dad's side, and kind of the way that our relatives and ancestors kind of, came from poverty to the United States or moved from places like North Carolina to California to look for economic opportunities. That really colored, like our understanding of who we were and what our family was growing up. And, I think that for a brief time in my life, my folks had, attained what they felt was the American dream, right? My mom and dad found each other, married each other, managed to buy a house and raise a family. And then, with a global financial meltdown, it all disappeared, right? And, as I said, like I graduated from college in 2009, right in the thick of the recession. It was not a great time to graduate college. I kind of was able to hold on to a life raft at a master's program for about a year. And then when I came home, basically, I was coming home to kind of help out because I knew things were bad at home, and I was hoping that I could, figure out what my next move was. And then, lo and behold, I was like everyone else struggling to find a job. My folks were driving Uber and Lyft, and I ended up being a temp worker at factories and warehouses in Southern California just to try to kind of make ends meet. And I would say that period was really important, right? Because, again, we were all very depressed. We were all really punishing ourselves for what felt like our different forms of failure. Mine being like, well, I did everything I was told to do. I got into the best schools that I could, got the best grades that I could. And here I am saddled with a whole bunch of debt working, as a temp, and I could be fired at the end of any shift, without any reason whatsoever, to say nothing of what my folks were going through at that same time. But, it was in that period, right, that I started to get into more conversations with my coworkers about kind of what they were going through, how they were getting through the recession. We got very, whether you're talking over a smoke break, as a waiter in a restaurant, whether it's a downtime when you're, working retail and you're just kind of chatting with your coworkers, or, if you have 10 minutes between shipments to kind of just get some water and talk to folks in a warehouse, those are kind of life-saving moments, right? They really keep you from falling into the abyss, as it were, and really kind of learning to see your coworkers as human beings who are going through struggles just like you are, and you learn to lean on one another. And that was really important to me, right? That was one of the ways that I was able to survive, that period. In the same way, my dad, when he was driving folks for Uber and Lyft, no matter how many times we as a family, told him that it wasn't his fault that a global financial meltdown happened, that never really sunk in. It was only when he was driving folks for a rideshare app and he was talking to them, to try to keep his ratings up. It was only then that he realized that he was driving folks who were his age, who had also lost their homes, other immigrants who were on their way to their second or third jobs. And it was then that he finally started to kind of realize that it wasn't just him, who had gone through this. And in fact, this was, a really big problem that was hurting a lot of working people. And so all of that together, again, I would say that I did have lofty goals about what I thought the show could do when I started it. But, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't guided by a deeply kind of personal goal to essentially try to get my dad to talk about the trauma that he had been through, which he was having a lot of trouble doing. And it was, it was hurting all of us. The fact that we couldn't, as a family, come together and talk about this and forgive ourselves, as it were, was really hurting our family dynamic and was hurting my parents' marriage. It was hurting our relationship with our parents. And so, when I started the podcast, I knew that was my main goal, was to try to get my dad to talk about this stuff. And it was incredible. Like, we turned the recorder on, and something about the idea that this would be recorded, that other people would hear it, something about that allowed him to open up in a way that he hadn't with me up until that point. We talked for hours, not just about what he had gone through in the recession, but we talked about his life. We talked about, growing up dirt poor in Mexico, being separated from his siblings and living in foster care, meeting my mom, all of that stuff. It was one of the best conversations I've ever had with my father. And I think it brought us a lot closer together. And it made me realize just how important giving that gift to one another is, right? The gift of listening to each other, the gift of, honoring one another's humanity enough to say, to listen attentively and give that sort of attention to, the greatest story that, any of us ever hear, right? Which is our own life story, right? Our life stories are so seldom given that sort of respect, but obviously they mean everything to us. And, living in a capitalist hellscape, right? I mean, like, that's, one of the first things that goes out the window, right? Is any sort of importance that we have as human beings is always secondary to, the value that we can produce for, our employers or, the economy or something like that. And so I saw in that time of my life, a battered population that was more and more alienated from itself, that people were having more and more trouble kind of not only talking to one another about what they were going through, but even seeing their stories as worth telling in the first place. And that makes us good subjects, right? It keeps us quiet. It keeps us docile. It keeps us depressed. We go into work, we put in our hours, we keep quiet, we go home, We buy what, think will make us happy. And then we just kind of get up and do it all again in the morning. But what we don't do is come together. What we don't do is show our scars to one another. What we don't do, or what we're not encouraged to do, is talk to our coworkers about how we're experiencing a lot of the same stuff, or our neighbors, or even our family members, getting to know one another on that deep sort of level. And once we do start opening those pathways up, once we do start, connecting with one another in that way, it makes it much more possible for us to build solidarity with one another and to act collectively together, whether it's in our workplaces or in our apartment buildings, in our schools, or on a national and political scale. It's the kind of tilling work, right, that is necessary for, a political movement to grow that is actually capable of addressing the vast systemic problems that are impacting all of us in different ways. So that, I guess, is my long-winded way of answering the question of like where it came from. I think that it wasn't necessarily that I thought like, the working class, that I had to focus on working class people, because that was the only, subject worth exploring. It was, I have a lot of fleshed out thoughts and feelings about it now, but, it really kind of came from that deep sort of personal, emotional attachment that I had to the struggle to survive, the struggle to, not completely lose myself to the daily grind and to find, reconnect with my family and coworkers and people, my neighbors, right, in a way that reminded us that we were actually human beings and that we actually deserve a lot better than this.
So you were talking about how your dad was able to open up through audio and like podcasting, basically. And so we were wondering, what role or roles do you see podcasts or podcasting as a medium playing in advancing social justice?
It's a really interesting question, right? Because, when I was still in academia, in a lot of ways, I was a media scholar, right? I think I kind of straddled three worlds, which was like media studies and media theory and political history and literature, right? And for my graduate work, I was really focused in on the intersection of those three things in early 20th century Mexico, and parts of the US. But essentially what I was looking at, right, was how people a century ago developed their politics in conversation with changing media technologies, how like the possibilities for communication such that they were, influenced their political thinking, their organizing, and even their imagination of what was possible. And what they could do in the world and what they could do to remake the world that they were living in, whether that was using newspapers and movable type, right? Whether that was using railroad networks to kind of shuttle newspapers to different parts of the country, whether that was, kind of clandestine networks to smuggle those newspapers or to smuggle information across the U.S.-Mexico border, or under the kind of watchful eye of a political dictatorship in Mexico leading up to the revolution, right? The forms of communication that were available to people and the creative means that they came up with to connect with one another, to share their ideas and their experiences, and to kind of collectively radicalize, like one another to the point of revolution was really fascinating to me. Because I didn't think that it was secondary, right? I didn't think that like the politics existed here and the media that kind of put that the political messages and whatnot out to other people were separate in another box. Those two things intersected always, and they always kind of impacted one another in a lot of unpredictable ways. And I think that's always been the case with media, right? Is not to get kind of too philosophical about it, but, media in its, kind of etymology, right, means the kind of middle, right? The in-between space, the things that connect that which is currently disconnected, right? We're doing it right now, right? Through the mediums of our respective microphones, the wires that are connecting our computers to electricity, to the internet. All of this has kind of created the possibility for us to be looking at one another and communicating with one another across vast, spaces. And that means, that creates a lot of opportunities that we wouldn't have had if we were all like writing letters to each other, right? Or if I, had to go there physically to be there with y'all to have this sort of conversation. So, I think that there's something fundamental about what media are and how we interact with them that kind of point to the fact that that point to how connected, like we are already, and how unfinished each of us is individually. What I mean by that, right, is that those media that connect us to one another, they are also the sort of pathways that allow us to kind of grow with each other and influence one another. And so in a way, it's like I was saying with politics, it's not like politics exists in one realm and then the media just kind of conveys the political messages to other people, right? It's more of a messy sort of knot where people are changing the more that they interact with those media and with one another. And that's, something kind of really beautiful, I think, because it tells us as human beings that, who we are is not just kind of inscribed in us from birth, right? We are always growing and becoming in conversation with the world that we're a part of. And media are the facilitators of that conversation. They are the things that connect the open parts of us to each other and to the rest of the world that we're in. They're the ways that we can imprint ourselves on the rest of the world and on other people. And, I think that that's kind of something that I don't, talk about super explicitly in the work that I do, but it's something that I think guides the work that I do in Working People and at the Real News Network, right? Because, you take the medium of podcasting, it is, again, a facilitator of a literal conversation between me and workers, many of whom I've never met in person, many of whom I may have only had a couple of conversations with, before that. But through that medium, like, we are sort of emptying parts of ourselves out, and like allowing those parts of ourselves to interact with each other in conversation. And then we walk away different people in a lot of ways because of the interactions that we have with that medium. And I think that there's something really powerful about that, and that speaks to, the sort of political function that media have as a connector between people, right? As again, a facilitator of dialogue that allows us to kind of become more than what we were before. And to do so in conversation with other people and who have lived vastly different lives than we have. So that's the kind of philosophical answer. The kind of practical answer that I would say quickly is, my media career has kind of like followed the weird evolutions of dominant media trends in the digital media ecosystem. Feels like, decades have happened in, the past 6 years, and my career is kind of like written into that, right? So like I, like many others, got my start writing for kind of leftist and independent political magazines around the time of the 2016 presidential primaries, when Donald Trump was really kind of exploding onto the political scene. So that Trump gave, it's an uncomfortable thing that we all live with, but Trump gave, most of us our start, and people in like kind of my generation gave a lot of us our start in media, because suddenly people were subscribing a lot more people were reading, right? And, so I was the columnist for a magazine called The Baffler and wrote for other magazines like Current Affairs and stuff like that. And then I noticed even within the span of like maybe 2 years, people were reading less, or they were reading less attentively, right? The more we got accustomed to changes in social media algorithms and so on and so forth, right? You could see that was when you started seeing on websites like the time it's going to take you to read an article, right? You started to see kind of other media companies adjust to this, being like, okay, well, reading long pieces is not what a lot of people are doing, or their moods are changing quite quickly. And so I was seeing that happening too, because I also wrote like 4,000 word essays, like I don't know how to be, as you guys can tell right now, I don't know how to be brief about stuff. So I was like, okay, well, clearly writing, there's going to be diminishing returns here. And I was looking around and seeing like kind of, the beginnings of this podcast surge a couple years ago. Not like podcasts had just, emerged. There's some that had existed for decades, but it really seemed that around 2016, 17, podcasts were really kind of coming up. And I was very attracted to the medium because it felt a lot more intimate, right? It felt like, when you have your headphones on and, you're listening to, a podcast, or you're listening to a conversation, like you're in a different sort of mode than you are when you're reading. And it's almost like the voices in your ears are kind of extensions of your own consciousness, right? And so even as a listener, I was noticing that, okay, like there's a lot of information that I want to convey, but there's also a really important sort of emotional and personal element that I think, is being missed in the ways that we're analyzing politics now. And podcasting seems to be a much more intimate way to get at that emotional stuff, that personal stuff. And so, that's how I approached it as a listener. And then I know we'll talk about this in a second, but then when I started podcasting myself or going on other podcasts, right, I started thinking about, how to cultivate that intimacy, through the microphone, right. And how to try to perform as a host or as a discussant, right? How to be a more responsible voice in someone else's head, I guess is how I would put it. And that was really important, especially when you're trying to talk to workers, many of whom have never been on a podcast before. Again, many of whom have never had the opportunity to share their story, even if it wasn't being recorded, right? In that way, holding that intimacy sacred, right? And giving it the sort of space that it needs for people to be able to share openly and be able to listen attentively was really important to me.
We were just talking about, the importance of like conversations and, like as seen in Working People, there's so many conversations that have been had, and it's a very long series. When you started out, did you always intend Working People to be an ongoing series, or did you ever think that it was going to be shorter term? Because from the first episode, it's kind of unclear what you thought the future of the podcast was.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you could almost convince yourself, like looking back, that that you had different designs in your head than you actually did. But yeah, if you go back and listen to the first season, I think that it gives you a more honest representation of where I was when I started the show. I did not know what I wanted the show to be or how expansive I would want the show to be. Again, like when I started, it was almost like the concept of a show was a ruse to get my dad on the show, right? It wasn't like a full ruse, because I was hoping that maybe this could be something, that maybe a limited series. I think there was a time where I thought maybe I could do like 6 of these, right? And I could have my dad be the guinea pig for the first one. But, I definitely didn't envision, that it would kind of grow into what it has when I first started. I mean, I started it with rented equipment from the University of Michigan library in my dinky little, at my desk in Ann Arbor. And I was trying to learn through the internet how to use GarageBand and edit my own shit. And so the audio quality kind of testifies that I was learning on the fly about how to kind of produce a podcast at that time. And I like to think I got better over the years. And then thank God I got enough Patreon subscribers to pay someone to do the production for me, the great Jules Taylor, who's our producer now. But yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I really didn't know how expansive I wanted the show to be when I started it. I knew that I wanted to, who I wanted to talk to. I knew that I wanted those conversations to not be what I was seeing or, in the kind of media that was around me, which was either discussions about workers where the voices of workers were curiously or incuriously absent, or, articles or cable news segments that really just took sound bites from people and more or less kind of reduced them to those sound bites. And, I just, again, for my own philosophical and personal reasons, having done a lot of these jobs myself and seen, like the sort of inhumanity with which we can treat working people, when we don't recognize them as flesh and blood human beings with complex lives and backstories and histories and feelings. And, when you wash all of that out, it makes it a lot easier to exploit people. It makes it a lot easier to not care that people are exploited. It makes it a lot easier to shut yourself off to what I think are natural feelings of empathy towards one another. And instead, we kind of start to treat each other as commodities, right? We start to see each other just as name tags and job titles and services that can be provided for payment. It's in that sort of complex that we wash our common humanity out of our vision, and we become kind of necessarily complicit in an increasingly dehumanizing economic and political system. I wanted to fight against that, and I knew that one way that I could try to do that was to get listeners to start to see people that they had never met before, or maybe had only met, when someone was delivering a package in their house, like to start to see at least a bit of that depth, of that complexity, of that humanity. And so, I guess another way to answer that is like, I think I got some things right when I started the show. Like, I actually didn't kind of write out like prepared questions, because I knew that it wasn't about what I was able to get out of people as an interviewer, right? It wasn't like where the conversation went. It was the fact that the conversation was happening in the first place that was important, right? And for me, I was like, well, it also seems like this kind of goes to your question, Sophie, is like, I also felt from a practical standpoint that I was like, well, this is a show that could go on forever because every person has a different story. Everyone has a unique and interesting story if you only give them the time and attention to tell it. And so, I guess there was this sense that it could go on forever. And then on a micro level, whenever I would have conversations, I'd be like, I'm going to see where this goes. Like, I'm going to try to get to know. I asked some of the same questions, like, where were you born? Tell me about your family, right? Like that kind of stuff. But they always go in different directions. And I kind of just follow where, the person I'm talking to leads me. But I knew that was the approach that I wanted to have. And you really just get so many amazing sort of detours and details about people's lives that you probably never would have gotten if you just came with a simple script of like, okay, here are 5 questions that I'm going to ask, each person. And so that was part of the essential project, right? Of you're not going to get everyone, the whole, rich tapestry of a person's life in a 1 hour or even 2 hour conversation, but you could at least get some of it, right? You could at least kind of start to understand how much you don't know, right? How vast that well of experience is in all of us, by just listening to one another for a couple hours. And so that was like really important for me, like from the kind of political side of things. But the last thing I would say on that is that, when I realized after like maybe the first 2 or 3 conversations, I was like, okay, I should do like a full season of this and then evaluate and see where I am. Then it became important, or more important to be like, all right, so whoever I choose to have on this season, it's going to be really, crucial, because it's going to kind of like, even if I don't say it out loud, it's going to signal to people like, here's who the working class is, right? And that's something I've always tried to like uncomfortably juggle, because I did make a decision at the very outset that I never wanted to define for listeners who or what the working class is, right? I wanted them to sort of build that understanding through the stories that they were hearing from workers in different industries, people doing different types of labor that, maybe we don't think about or even think about as labor, right? I wanted that to sort of inform who and what, people saw as the working class. And so, I knew that I wanted to have like a student on. So I had the great Lauren Shandoval on, like, I think in episode 4. The second episode was with Glendana Shevlin, who works at Disney Hotel in Anaheim. I knew that I wanted to have sex workers on. I knew that I wanted to talk to people in manufacturing, right? And try to give at least some sense to listeners that the working class is incredibly vast and diverse, and we should check ourselves when we start kind of pretending that it's not that, right? That the working class is just, I don't know, white guys working in the roughneck trades like manufacturing or, logging or stuff like that, right? Like it's a lot more complex than that, just like every human being is a lot more complex than we give them credit for. And so that was something that I think I got right in the beginning. There was a lot that I got wrong, but I guess the last thing I would say is that as the show has grown and as that project has matured, I have felt like it makes it all the more important to keep the show going and to continuously build out that archive, because the more that you listen to the show, I think the more apparent it becomes that like you can't just sort of categorize working class people in one sort of easy bucket, right? But there are really crucial things that connect us, that connect our experiences, and those are the things that we should be sort of focusing on when we're trying to organize people, when we're trying to kind of build a sense of common solidarity, at the same time that you learn to appreciate what makes every individual unique and beautiful.
Thank you. Okay, so is there any early episode standouts to you that, is especially important to the development of the show, apart from or in addition to the first episode?
So, yeah, it's hard because, like, I mean, I have such kind of pointed and fond memories of each one. Occasionally, I will go back and like listen to an older episode. It's good. It's good because it reminds me of, again, what the core of the project is. If I ever feel I'm losing sight of that, it also reminds me of it's a humbling experience because, again, I'll go back and I'm like, man, this audio sounds like shit, or I'll be like, man, I really should have had someone editing my intros so they weren't 20 minutes long. I think I did learn, some important things just from a practical podcasting sense. So I'll say that first, and then I'll kind of follow up to answer your question. But since I know you're all working on your own kind of projects and figuring this stuff out for yourselves, I would say that one of the most valuable things that I learned through the first season of Working People was how to pay my listeners the same respect that I was trying to pay to the people I was interviewing, right? How to treat them and their attention spans and you know, the context in which they'll be listening, like with that same sort of respect, right? I didn't ever want to take listeners for granted, right? To just assume that just because I put it out there, people are going to listen to it. It's like, well, no, you know, you've got to work for that. You've got to make this appealing to people, right? You've got to try to be the kind of host. Again, if you're that voice in someone's head, you almost have to kind of perform their questions, right? Their curiosity, their incredulity, their whatever, right? There's so many things that, again, we've all had that experience where as a listener, you know, you're hearing a conversation and you just hope that the host asks the question that's on your mind. And if they don't, it's very frustrating, right? And so I would say the entire show is a constant exercise in empathy, right? You know, you have to constantly flex and build those empathy muscles to try to think about, okay, you know, not only what kinds of questions should I ask or how should I respond when someone is sharing a really personal story, but also like, how do I, as a good shepherd of information and conversation, like how do I sort of make this something that people are going to be able to listen to and receive in a way that you know, communicates the power of what's being said, right? And, you know, I would say that's kind of what led me to ultimately understand that, you know, yeah, the conversation should speak more for themselves. So cut down the intros for Pete's sake, right? You know, like you don't have to, and also like, you know, I was constantly worried or I was in this mindset that I was like, okay, every episode you're going to grow your listenership by this much. So every episode you have to remind people or introduce people to the concept of the show, right? But then again, if you're doing that over and over again, the people who are already listening are going to get very kind of tired of it. And so you have to kind of navigate that, right? You have to figure out, okay, like how do I set up each episode so that if this is the first episode that anyone ever listens to, they will know what the show's about. They will, you know, be entertained or captivated enough to listen to the end, but they also won't feel lost, right? So there's a lot of those sorts of questions that I was better able to answer after doing the first season. You know, I would say when I think about like the other point that I wanted to make on that front is like, again, from the conceptual side, wanting the show to be something that demonstrated how deep and rich and complex our life experiences are. I wanted the episodes to be like 3 hours long, right? You know, and some of them are close to that if you go to the first season. And you know, I realized that that's a lot to ask of listeners. It's a hell of a lot to ask of interviewers or interviewees. But so I learned that, okay, you know, you gotta be around an hour and a half max. You know, you're not going to capture an entire person's life story in a podcast episode, and you're actually doing them a disservice by making the episode into something that fewer people are going to listen to because it's so long, because it's long-winded or what have you, right? So those are the kind of general points that I started to learn as I was in the process of doing the show. But yeah, I would say some of the things that really stick out to me as an interviewer were, you know, I think about like two that really stick out to me in that first season are, you know, an interview I did with a woman who was working at an Amazon fulfillment center. Like this was people were talking about Amazon, but it wasn't nearly at the level that it is now, where it's much more commonly known how shittily Amazon treats its workers. Those stories were kind of coming out in bits and in drips. And so I spoke to a woman, Vicki Shannon Allen, who was a Amazon worker in Texas. I'd only talked to her on the phone once before that to kind of like, you know, prepare. We ended up talking for about 3 hours, and we didn't even mention Amazon, I don't think, until like an hour and a half in, right, we ended up talking just about her backstory, how she grew up. She had a really rough upbringing. She had a kind of evil stepmother who treated her terribly and abused her. We talked about how she met her partner and then like falling in love and then falling out of love and getting divorced and how heartbreaking that was. And there was, a point where, we were just talking, I think, Matt, about her upbringing. And I mean, she kind of started crying, and, I was tearing up, and I was just so struck, right, by like how raw the conversation was getting, and how incredible it was that this woman that I had never met, was sharing such intimate and traumatic details of her life with me. And I realized, again, kind of like I did with that first episode with my dad, that I was like, it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with me, right? It's not like I'm doing anything like really important here. It's just, this is more than anything a testament to the fact that like this person has been sitting on this trauma for so long and has seldom been given the chance to talk about it with someone who's actually listening to them this attentively. That was the only role that I was filling. The rest was just a testament to, again, how alienated we are from each other and how important it is to do that sort of emotional work, to allow ourselves to connect with each other in that way, to share our stories and to commiserate and to see one another, as human beings, right? In a sort of non-judgmental, empathetic way. Even if, you have vastly different political views, right? Seeing and hearing that pain that Vicky kind of shared with me and feeling it myself, as we were talking, I think that was maybe when I realized that this is more than a series. I think that's when I realized it's like, oh man, like there's so much that we are taught to push down, right? And and that causes so much damage to us personally, to our relationships, and definitely to us politically, right? The less able we are to connect with one another on that level, the more that we train ourselves to believe that our life stories are that insignificant that we don't want to burden anyone with sharing them for, most of our lives. It really kind of conveyed to me the importance of providing that listening ear and trying to build a listenership so that people could have that sort of forum to share their stories and feel seen and heard for the human beings that they are. And then the other, because I think I recorded it pretty soon after that, but the episode that I recorded with LaDonna Brave Bull Allard from the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe in season 1, thanks to a connection that I got through a brilliant journalist, Frances Madison. I was exceedingly fortunate to get to talk to LaDonna, who passed away last year. But she's one of the most incredible people I've ever spoken to. And if you listen to that episode, and I did a remastered version of it, I think last season, so I would recommend listening to that version because the audio is better. But I mean, her story is just so powerful. She's just not just her story, but she as a storyteller is so incredibly powerful. And I barely did anything in that. I forgot I was supposed to ask questions half the time in that interview just because I was so captivated by every word that she was saying, the emotion in it, the detail in it, the humanity in it. And I left just feeling, again, like I was so much more than who and what I was going into that conversation afterwards, that that I learned, there, not just how important it is for other people to hear these stories, but also how important it is for me to kind of grow with these conversations, right? To be open and vulnerable as much as I can, and to not just be a voyeur, right? To not just kind of be there trying to pull details out of people. So you'll notice, if you listen to the show, that I share a whole lot about myself in there and my family. There are probably details in there that I talk more openly about on the show that are being listened to by people I've never met, that I probably have had struggles talking about with my own friends back home or in Chicago or whatever. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I did learn, I think, a lot about myself, the project of the show, the importance of people telling their stories in this sort of way. But I also learned as I went on how to be a more responsible podcast host and a better sound editor.
As our time comes to a close, we'd like to invite you to share about any current or ongoing projects that are important to you and that we should check out.
And in addition, if you have just a little bit of time, some advice you have for students like us who are just starting out podcasts.
Yeah. So I'll try to answer the last one first, right? So like, this, I get uncomfortable talking a lot about myself, and then I'm just like, well, I hope this is useful, right? But I mean, I definitely want to leave y'all with something that you can use in your own project, which I'm really excited to see where all of that goes. I guess I would say the first big piece of advice that I would give, which is kind of implied in everything that I've kind of said so far, right, is know what you're doing it for, right, and who you're doing it for, right, because there are a lot of ways that you can sort of be tricked into feeling like you're doing it for something else. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're doing something that's public facing work, if you are ultimately kind of trying to compete for listeners, right, in a very crowded marketplace, you can you're inevitably going to get sucked into that sort of competitive mindset that, we all experience through social media, right? It's like everyone's trying to kind of get clout. Everyone's trying to get noticed. It feels like a personal slight if people don't notice you, or if people aren't listening to you, if they're not sharing your stuff. And that can, it's human to feel that. Everyone feels that. I still feel it, right? So like, that's not going to go away. So I guess the one thing I would say is, like, if you're like going to be, if you're going to be trying to build, right, you're never going to really be able to fill that hole, right? Even the people who like have, are earning like lots of money on Patreon and have, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of listeners, it's still never enough, right? So don't get sucked into that black hole of feeling like, the value of your work is defined by the number of people listening to it, sharing it, so on and so forth, right? Obviously, you always want to be mindful of that. Obviously, we all want bigger listenerships. That's an inevitable part of it. Just don't get consumed by it, because, then you're going to be miserable. Your work's going to suffer. You're going to resent people that you should be collaborating with. And, it's just a very toxic sort of complex to get sucked into. So I would say, as best as you can, try to kind of fight that off and try to not make your work, try to not make that the defining sort of thing of what you do. Right. And I would say the other part that's kind of been implicit in everything that we've been talking about is like really have a sense of who your audience is, like who you want your audience to be, and be a responsible host, right? I mean, don't take your audience for granted. Don't don't be too self-indulgent, right? I mean, like, try to, again, really flex those empathy muscles so that you are creating something that, reaches people on the level that you want to reach them at. It's going to be messy, right? You're going to have to go through trial and error. You should want feedback from people being like, hey, like that was really powerful when you did that. This other thing, maybe not so much, right? I mean, take the feedback that is useful, the feedback that is in bad faith as best as you can, push that to the side, right? And don't let that kind of, again, don't let that, all those other outside voices kind of be the thing that determine what your projects are, right? You should still have a sense of what you want it to be and kind of approach it in that sort of artistic vein, while also being empathetic to your subjects and to your audience and stuff like that. So, yeah, I guess I would just say, like, you know, having started that show in graduate school with 0 listeners to now, you know, working at the Real News Network, and Working People is now partnered with the Real News and In These Times. And I do a lot of work there. I do a lot of other types of interviews and stuff like that. You know, in that kind of long evolution, you know, it's like I said, a lot of these things never truly go away. But I think that the only thing that's kept me sane and the only thing that's kept my work from becoming bad, you know, hopefully, is maintaining that sense of commitment to the people that I want to serve with it, right? Not only the folks that I'm talking to, but the folks who are listening, and ultimately to, you know, working class people, and kind of people everywhere, right? And, you know, everyone, even if you're like, you know, you grew up middle class, right? We all ultimately have more in common in relationship to the means of production and to like the 1% than we have differences. And there's so many things in our society that try to divide us up and keep us apart from one another and keep us, again, from feeling that our lives and our stories and our struggles are like that they matter. And we got to fight against that, right? And so, you know, I think always keeping that front and center, being dedicated to people and honoring their humanity and the things that make us human, is what ultimately keeps me honest. And it's what allows me to kind of get out of those depressive funks when I start getting really pissed that, like, you know, the people who are getting all the views or listens or donations are the people who are just, you know, out there kind of slinging mud at each other to make a name for themselves, when I'm over here trying to get people to listen to these really deeply personal stories. That can get very frustrating. I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't. But again, the only way that you can kind of stay committed is to know who you're committed to and why.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. It was an honor to be here. I'm sorry we didn't get more back and forth, but I hope that was useful, and it was an honor to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Well, hello again, everyone. So this is the postscript that I promised y'all in the introduction for this special episode that we're running on the Working People feed, featuring a roundtable discussion and interview that I got to do with a great class being taught at Tulane by Billy Saas called Intro to Podcasting and Social Justice. So y'all just heard the conversation that I got to have with Billy's class. And as you heard there at the end, we kind of ran out of time before we could get to all the questions. And I take full responsibility for that because my answers are always very long-winded. But I also blame you guys because you knew that when you invited me to come talk. So we'll call it 50-50. But, you know, I figured that if it was possible, we should definitely try to kind of hop back on another call so that we could, you know, get through the questions that we didn't get to when I got to speak to the class. And also, really importantly, to do what I was really looking forward to on that day we recorded, which was hearing more about the projects that the students in the class were doing or are continuing to do. So, you know, we don't have the whole class here, and we're recording this, you know, a couple weeks after the recording that you just listened to. But I am so grateful to be joined by Billy, by Sophia and Sophie from the class. We're recording this over the holiday break. I am in quarantine, so we figured no better time than the present to kind of record this sort of follow-up. And I'm really excited about that and really grateful to everyone for making time for this. So Yeah, I guess with that, maybe just to kind of refresh folks' memories, could we go around the table and introduce ourselves real quick?
Yeah, I'm Sophia Badami, and actually as of a day ago, I've decided to switch to an environmental studies major. And yeah, I guess how that kind of plays into podcasting is with environmental studies, there's a lot of, I guess, social justice and climate activism and everything involved with that. So I think podcasting is a great outlet to share what I've learned through that major. And also the project that I've been working on actually has to do a little bit about environmentalism and, yeah, just that in general.
All right. Hi, I'm Sophie Harris. I'm a freshman here at Tulane. I haven't declared any majors for sure, but right now I'm looking into majors in communication and digital media production. And I'm also looking into maybe a minor in political science. So I started taking this class just kind of as, like a beginning communications class. And I've just been really drawn to podcasting like throughout this course because kind of in the future, I really want to look into possibilities with documentary production. And so kind of producing media about like topics I'm passionate about. And I think podcasting is another great medium to kind of, just like really deep dive into a topic and like share with a wide audience, just like different stories. So yeah, that's kind of what drew me to communications and digital media.
And I'm Billy Saas. I'm a professor of practice at Tulane, teaching this course and some others. Got into podcasting probably not long before you, Max, with the podcast Money on the Left. And since then developed an organization called the Money on the Left Editorial Collective. Continue to publish podcasts and vertical pieces for that. But I got into podcasting primarily because I wanted to have some conversations I felt like needed to happen but weren't happening elsewhere. And that has sort of evolved into a really nice sort of hybrid academic activist orientation toward like economic justice and issues of like, democratic praxis.
Hell yeah. And if folks aren't already, you should definitely check out Money on the Left. It's a great show. And, I figured, we'd give a big shout out to all of those who couldn't be here, right? Since obviously the semester's over. But I guess like by way of kind of getting us back into the conversation that we had a few weeks ago, I wanted to ask how the course went and kind of how things rounded up for all of y'all. Maybe, I guess, any particularly like exciting or interesting things that you got from the class or that came from the class?
Personally, I thought the podcast pitch is what we just worked on in our opening monologue was one of my favorite projects of this semester because it actually made me think about how I want to continue what I've learned in this class, maybe throughout the rest of my, I guess, academic career and maybe pursue this podcast. And it actually made me want to switch my major a little bit, diving in a little bit about learning about my pitches about like inadequate composition of food and like the American food system. And it made me, all the research and knowledge I gained made me want to switch my majors. And I also learned a lot about just audio production and, significance of audio in podcasting, which, just all kind of shaped what I've learned, I guess.
Yeah. So from this class, I'd say probably one of my favorite aspects of it was really the collaborative nature. Like I did really enjoy getting to listen to like all these different kinds of podcasts that were already out there. One of the assignments we had to do was make a niche list. So we kind of found a topic we were interested in, and we had to find all these different podcasts relating to the topic. And I thought it was really interesting kind of like exploring different podcasts and seeing how ones I already listened to tied back into social justice. So it just really like opened me up to like all the different topics that are out there. And I did really enjoy listening to everyone else's opening monologue at the end of the class, because it was just really cool, like, being around so many like talented and creative people. And it made me think, oh, maybe my podcast has a future, but it also made me think of, like 10 to 15 different podcast ideas I could do, like even stemming from that. So I just really enjoyed that part of the class.
I'm curious, was it exciting or daunting to kind of swan dive into the world of podcasting and see how many of them are out there?
It was pretty intimidating, just because, there's such a mass volume. And so it's kind of like listening to lots of different ones and finding which ones kind of align with your personal like style, I guess, or kind of, like there's so many different podcasts out there. So it's kind of like Netflix, like when you go to Netflix and you want to watch a show and you're just faced with like this great like mass volume and you feel like you don't even know where to start.
Yeah. And it is a little scary too, I have to say, if you have like an idea for a podcast or want to create your own podcast and you have like a certain idea of what you want to make it about, and then you start researching podcasts that are already about that, and you're like, oh shoot, so now how is mine going to be different, and how am I going to make this when there's so many, with similar topics? So yeah, that was a little bit, when I was making my podcast pitch a little bit, I was like, oh God, how is mine going to be different?
Well, you're in good company because we all feel that way. And Billy, how about you? How did the class go for you as the instructor?
It was a bit of a dream. Honestly, the coolest thing for me too was the opening monologues, except I just got to kind of sit back and listen at the end of the semester, and just so much good work. Also talking to folks like you for the class, throughout the class, and getting a, sort of, I have my experience with podcasting. I have my experience with like social justice activism and things like that. But to talk to other people who are doing this work about the specific labor that they're doing, in your case, like starting a podcast in grad school and then sort of piecing it together along the way. And then in the case of someone like Chandra Thomas Whitfield, who we talked to, who did the podcast In the Gap for In These Times, about being a freelance journalist and finding some grant money to make what ended up being like a totally essential, I think, podcast series. But yeah, and then seeing what students are listening to and listening to that too. And sort of, I feel like I have a read on the situation or a read on the scene, as it were. And I don't. Like there's so much, it's so vast and growing every day. So it was just a real pleasure to continue learning alongside the students all semester.
Yeah, you really get humbled in moments like those, right? Because you kind of realize just how much the algorithms do sort of limit what you see. So when you go, away from your social media feeds and you start searching for podcasts by topic, and you also see how many people are listening to them, you're like, where are all these people? Where have these podcasts been, right? Or how have I been so blind to all of this? So I think it's, it's both daunting, but also probably in another way, pretty necessary, right? Because we can all get very locked into that sort of, I'm a creature of habit and taste, right? So like I find like 5 restaurants that I like, and I just order from the same ones all the time. So yep. I think it's good and healthy to broaden our horizons. So that's great. I'm really, excited. I was really excited to learn about this class. I'm so happy to hear that it happened and that you were leading it, Billy, and that you had, even from the limited interaction that I got to have with them, your students seemed awesome, including present company. It's really wild to kind of think how things have gone since we started our shows to where we are right now. But I think it's also a very exciting thing. So I guess since we're already on the topic, we've heard me talk for the better part of 50 minutes on this recording. But since we're kind of already talking about the class itself, I was wondering if we could, keep that thread going, and we can maybe circle back to any remaining questions that y'all had for me. But I was curious to know a bit more about the class itself, and how Sophie and Sophia, your particular projects developed, and if there were others, from folks who aren't here that we wanted to kind of mention. I guess just kind of flipping the mic around and returning the favor and learning more about you guys in the class.
Well, I might be able to provide some helpful kind of framing, syllabus, structural information and sort of set Sophie and Sophia up. So my thinking in setting up the class, which is itself a pretty daunting proposal. This is my first semester at Tulane, and hired more or less specifically to do something like this, and figuring out what we're going to talk about. 15 weeks is a long time, but it's not that long when you have to talk about, when it's a survey course, so you touch on a bunch of different things. But it was a daunting but exciting thing to do. So where we landed was, people were going to get experience working on a remote podcast production project. So recording over Zoom, taking advantage of the fact that more or less everybody knows how to use Zoom now. And in COVID, we get to talk to some really cool people doing interesting work all over the country. And why not get folks in teams to work with, to plan for, prep for, and ultimately produce and edit an episode of an interview with somebody who's doing social justice podcast work. Again, in different roles. So we had freelance journalists, we had professional sound designer David Herman from the Floodlines Podcast. We had a producer, we had another freelance journalist. It was just a really great a sampling. So ultimately we had Victoria Bulubasis, who does freelance journalism and film work. Great episode for Living Downstream called Chicken Country that folks should check out. And then Floodlines Podcast, which is definitely very pertinent to the class. We talked to Catherine Wells, who produced that, and David Herman, who did sound design. Talked to you, and then also talked to Chandra Thomas Whitfield. So there's the team experience, the group experience, which is something that I think that through my own work in podcasts has been illuminating. I like to collaborate, but this is a different kind of collaboration than you get in grad school, I feel like, unless you seek out podcasting, right? So there's that. And then there was also the individual podcast pitch. So I can't think of the whole semester. I've been bummed out about not thinking of a better word. Maybe someone can help me figure it out. But doing market research as kind of like the first task here. So by the end of the semester, students would have, rather than, feeling the burden and pressure to produce a podcast in total, spend a lot of time in the semester thinking about and listening to other podcasts, and then coming up with their own idea based on the listening that they've done and the market research, right, that they've done in terms of their specific niches. So the team project, exposure to people doing great work in the field, and then the individual project. So hopefully folks are ready to get going in podcasting beyond the class. So that's the general framework. And we talk a lot about political economy of podcasting too. There's a lot happening right now in the podcast, scare quotes, space, right? Spotify and Apple and everything, the kind of cool, weird possibilities of podcasting seem to be kind of under threat. And so we talk a lot about that stuff too. And of course, we started off by reading The Podcast University by Maximilian Alvarez for the Chronicle of Higher Education.
Hell yeah. I mean, I'm glad that y'all covered that, because that's something that I've wanted to, if I was still on a university campus, I would very much want to talk to students like Sophie and Sophia about this, right? I think I may have mentioned this when I was talking to your class, Billy, but the thing I miss most about academia is teaching, is being in the classroom, that, being surrounded by other hungry minds and brilliant young people is where I feel the most intellectually alive, and where I feel like I'm actually learning the most, because you're kind of building off of each other. Everyone's bringing their own different perspectives and life experiences, and you kind of put your hands on the thing that you're building together. And you really kind of come out of it, I think, with a lot of different understandings of the topic that you wanted to discuss, and how podcasting as a medium and as an quote unquote industry has changed is something that I'm really, really fascinated in / terrified by, because when Billy and I started ours, right, it was still maybe the tail end of the Wild West days of podcasting, right? Where it was more thinkable to just kind of, get some equipment, start your own shit, and self-promote. And we saw a number of shows like take off that way. And that's, what we tried to do. And I remember, I think it was after the second season of Working People, that was when you started seeing more and more like, oh, Conan O'Brien's got a podcast. Oh, like, Ted Cruz has a podcast. All these like big mainstream networks are basically pivoting, or not pivoting, but they're adding podcasts to their roster. And then like the consolidation of distribution under platforms like Spotify, I was like, well, fuck. Right? Sorry, I didn't mean to swear. That's great. They ruin everything. So anyway, but I guess we don't have to go down the dark path. So, but yeah, Sophie and Sophia, why don't you maybe walk us through your progression in the class? So like you mentioned a little bit about maybe why you took it, but I guess maybe for listeners, could you walk us through why you wanted to take the class, what you learned during it, and kind of how your own desire to participate in that podcasting ecology like grew over the course of the semester?
Yeah, for sure. I pretty much just thought about taking the class. I was on my meeting with my academic advisor, and I knew I wanted to do some kind of introductory communication course, because that was what I was interested in. And she was kind of looking through the selection with me, and she was like, oh, well, podcasting and social justice is open. And, I was just like, well, I like podcasts. And that was really like very baseline why I ended up taking it in the first place. And yeah, just throughout the class, I really enjoyed just like learning more about kind of, how podcasts are made, and kind of getting into the nitty gritty of just not even the technical audio element, but kind of like from beginning to end, like how they kind of come to fruition. I did really enjoy all of the times we got to listen in on other groups doing their final interview project, because it was just really insightful to kind of see, the method behind everything. So yeah, and then my progression with my own individual podcast pitch, I kind of knew from the beginning that I'm really passionate about the topics of, like body positivity, but also more specifically kind of like body image and body neutrality. And that's, something I'm very passionate about. For a while, I've been listening to this podcast called I Weigh by Jamila Jamil. She's an actress who is known for like her work on The Good Place. That's also kind of like one of the first podcasts I ever really listened to in depth. And so I kind of took that as a jumping off point for, building my niche list and finding other podcasts in that area. And then also coming to eventually my own individual podcast pitch. And so my kind of proposed podcast idea, it's called Weighing In, Body Image, Positivity, and Neutrality on College Campuses. And so it's kind of taking this idea of, body image and focusing it with the specific lens of, okay, well, how does this translate to people going through the undergraduate experience? And so either like kind of like undergraduate experience, and then also people in that age frame. So kind of, late teens, early 20s. And so, yeah, that was my opening monologue, and I kind of imagined it as a limited series, 8 episodes, and each time I'd talk with a different, every time I'd talk with someone from a different university, kind of showing how like, even though like all college campuses are different, like there's a lot that's similar. And so it'd be either talking to like students or professors or just someone affiliated with an American campus. And so, if I ever do end up making this podcast, I think I'm just really interested in looking into, how are college students and professors and faculty specifically impacted by, the way like our bodies and other bodies are viewed by like each other, and then also media, because it's such like a vulnerable and like new like part of life for so many people. And it's just a very vulnerable time. And so I think it's a really interesting thing to examine. Yeah. So that's kind of my project. Yeah. My final project.
Hell yeah. I mean, I think that sounds brilliant and, very, very apt, right? And I say that, someone who's dealt with those issues myself, right? I think a recent episode of Working People that we did, where I interviewed Justin Mayhew, who's a General Motors worker in Kansas City, I believe. We ended up talking for the first half of that kind of about our adolescence, and we talked about somehow we ended up on the subject of body image stuff. Like, and I mentioned that there's this one painful memory that I have of being back home and looking through old family pictures with my sister and seeing one of my brothers playing basketball in the driveway outside. And I told my sister, I was like, man, Jesse and Zach look good in that picture. And McKenna was like, that's you on the left. Right. And I had to double take, and I looked, and it was me. And it just really kind of broke my heart the longer I stewed on that, because I realized that even when I was at my thinnest, right, in my, I was playing 3 sports in high school, and I never saw myself that way. I only saw myself as the kind of chubby, awkward kid that, my brothers and other friends made fun of. And so it was like seeing the thing that I thought I always wanted, and knowing that even when I had it, I didn't see myself that way. And then that was soon before I went to college. So yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and I think it's a really rich and important topic. And the way that you described it, I think is so compelling. So I don't know. Maybe as a potential listener, I would say I would listen to the hell out of that. Sophia, what about you?
So first off, that's how I came to see the podcasting class. Like Sophie said, I was looking through intro to comm classes, and I saw podcasting, and I was like, oh, wow, how cool. Like a super hands-on form of communication. Like I want to be a part of that. So I took the class, and basically, what I learned is how, like, I've always thought of podcasting as something so complex and something that, I could never do that. Like, how would I, like, have the confidence to, like, speak like that to other people, find issues that other people and I care about, and, like, just how do I even approach it? And it basically took, something like podcasting, and it broke it down into something less complex and something that I could approach. And I never thought I could even, make a pitch for a podcast, and I did. And it basically just kind of gave me insight on podcasting and how to break it down and make something of my own. So basically, my podcast would be Food Ruption, and Food Ruption is about the corruption in the American food industry. It's discussing environmental issues, public health issues, public health crises, economic motivation, and human rights. It's about the inadequate knowledge of consumers and the composition of food products. And it is basically how this inspired me, as I've always been interested in how bigger corporations affect us and how the food industry affects us, because it's something we partake in, again, and contribute to every day, or at least every week, and something, we're eating at least 3 times a day. So it's something that, affects us every day. I was trying to work in how to tie in, how these big corporations and how the food industry, tie in together. And, just like the environmental implications of certain corporations, unethical practices, faults in the FDA, and how a government agency, contributes to this, and how there are so many faults in a government agency and how we need to change it. And I would bring in certain people like sociologists, historians, families or individuals that have lost a loved one due to foodborne illness, to take an intersectional lens at the food industry. And basically that's a little bit about my podcast. And
that's awesome. I mean, you're right. It's like something that is a fundamental part of our everyday lives that we know actually very little about, right? I mean, this was a point that was made repeatedly to me, this year, as we spoke with workers on strike at Frito-Lay, Kellogg's, workers from No Evil Foods and other type, parts of the food industry, just seeing behind the scenes and thinking about the people involved in that production process. And even from like picking, the produce to, making the products to delivering stuff. It's just such a complicated, ecology. And yet, like, for us, it really just kind of starts at the grocery store, right? And you could kind of see how bonkers people went when, stuff in the grocery store wasn't there, right? From the beginning of the pandemic, when toilet paper was all, cleared out, to, Kellogg's stuff being off the shelves or Frito-Lay stuff being off the shelves, people flipped out, right? Because I think we depend so much on that food system, but know so little about it and have so little control over it, that we really are just naked consumers in the wilderness. So I think that that's really, an important topic. It also, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to one of my own students, Jack Griffin, who was a star student, really, really brilliant guy. And he went on to graduate and found, an app called Food Finder, which basically maps out all of the available food pantries for people who are food insecure, and they can find, stuff in their area, and people can learn easily how to donate food. And it's just really taken off. And during the pandemic, it's been a huge, lifesaver for so many people. And I'm couldn't be prouder of Jack for all the great work that he does. So I mentioned that just to kind of, say that, like, these things can snowball from a little idea into something really important that, you end up committing yourself to, just like Jack did. So I think that sounds awesome, Sophia. And, Billy, I was wondering if, again, for the students who couldn't be here, if you could give us like a little bit of an overview of how the class went and where these final projects sort of ended up.
I'd love to read out all their names because they all did great work. But speaking just broadly and I guess thematically, we had a lot of, and I think maybe I was surprised and shouldn't have been, a lot of work. A lot of podcasts proposed that were reflecting on the role of social media and social justice and sort of coping with social media. And related to the body image issue, but then also thinking about the role of influencers in taking a position or not, right, on certain social justice issues. A podcast produced along those lines from somebody who is themselves probably considered an influencer in the class, which is pretty cool. I don't think I'd actually met anyone with over 100,000 followers before, but there we go. Who was helping to wanted to sort of, I think that self-care was another sort of element that came up persistently across podcasts, and how to kind of cope with living in, nobody put it this way, but I might, like, sort of neoliberal hellscape, right? Like, how do we cope with, our digital lives? And anyway, so this particular podcast was about, kind of coming out online and coming to terms with, embracing one's sexuality and identity and becoming comfortable with that and kind of providing an outlet for people who are having trouble along those lines to interact with this podcast. And we also had some prison abolition oriented podcasts, podcast about access to abortion in the South. And that is a very big issue, of course, and has been for a while, and will probably continue to be. But in Louisiana, right, it's not easy to think about access or to find access to women's reproductive health services and specifically abortions. So the gamut there, and then we had, of course, like, I don't know, some that might be considered more along the kind of pop cultural, but still significant in the social justice register. Podcast about like social justice and superheroes, right? So thinking about and through films and comic books, both current and past, and the way that they promote or, undermine, or how they sort of interact with issues that we find significant socially today. So, I mean, some pretty deep ones and difficult conversations, and so a wide spectrum of topics, from the culture that we interact with every day to the things that we, like Sophia is talking about, the things that we interact with every day and don't think about, to things that we ought to be thinking about but are not. And yeah, I think that's overall, if every single one of these podcasts were turned into a series or an ongoing podcast, I think we'd all be better off. The media landscape would be improved significantly.
You know, that it's funny you mentioned that, because like this whole time I'm like thinking about the media landscape, and like now, not just as a podcaster trying to make my way in that landscape, but as the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, like, you know, my livelihood and the livelihoods of the other people who work here and our whole project kind of depend on navigating that landscape. And it sucks, right? Because, like, you know, YouTube, the algorithm there is a pain in the ass. You can get, there have been like people who've had their entire channels just taken down, like with no warning and no recourse. Facebook, like, you know, openly admits to like downgrading, you know, platforms like ours so that people just aren't seeing it. When Facebook used to be, and in a lot of ways still is, like our main connector point to audiences. When your whole, like, you know, network is precariously balanced on this kind of digital landscape that's controlled by private profit-seeking companies and their black box algorithms, it gets very anxiety producing. But, you know, what makes me hopeful, right, is stuff like this, right? You know, people putting good content out there, using, you know, their different social media platforms and followings to get messages out, right? You know, even a dinky, you know, podcast like Working People, we teamed up with another small podcast, Morning Riot, for this 6-hour live stream fundraiser for striking Kellogg's workers. And in 6 hours, you know, we raised like, you know, close to $16,000 for these folks. And that's really awesome. That's because like we had people listening in and watching in from Australia and Germany, and people donating, and like, so, you know, the internet can be good, right? We can use it for good. There's just a lot of bad shit there. And I actually wanted to ask y'all about that, because I was very curious about this when we first talked, when I came to the class, was like, are podcasts still a big thing for Gen Z? Like, I mean, because I worry about this. As, you know, for the Real News, we do podcasts, we do YouTube shows, we do text articles as well. So we're kind of a multimedia operation. But when I think about, you know, where kind of the next generation is going for its news and stuff like that, like it's not usually where not just the Real News, but so many other outlets are. And so the question is like, you know, where's this all going? So I was curious, Sophie and Sophia, if like podcasts were a big thing for you before you took the class?
So personally, I think sometimes I find my news through podcasting. Like, there's just one podcast, when I ever wanted to like just learn something or learn about history or something, I would always go to the podcast Shit You Should Care About. But from what I've learned, Gen Z typically doesn't find their news from podcasts or don't really listen to podcasts as much unless there's a big name attached to it. Like you were kind of just talking about, like, unless there's a big name like Emma Chamberlain attached to it or some influencer, which I think is honestly kind of a shame, because I think there's a lot of podcasts out there like your podcast, or, you know, people that are actually trying to educate people about issues or talk about, you know, niche topics that we don't know about a lot about. And then there's like influencers that, I don't know, that, you know, some definitely have a lot to say, but then, you know, there's some that just kind of like take over the podcasting industry and, you know, take away voices from other people. But yeah, that's kind of how I think of it, is unless there's a big name attached to it, a lot of people won't listen to it.
Yeah, exactly. Sophia, I was actually going to say the same exact thing of, you know, like, I think if you ask someone, I think there are very few people who kind of independently listen to podcasts, but it just feels like like, I feel like there was a period of time, like maybe 10 years ago when, you know, YouTube was a really big medium and it felt like every single big YouTuber made a book. And I feel like now it's like every major TikToker, every major celebrity, everyone has a podcast. And some of them are handled really well, but a lot of times a lot of them just feel like they're talking about fluff. And so, you know, some of them are of good substance, but, you know, a lot of times it just feels like they're making a podcast to say they have one. Like, there's this big TikTok star who rose to fame a couple years ago named Charli D'Amelio, and she and her sister just randomly started a podcast, and I maybe listened to 5 minutes of it, and I couldn't get through it. And I think there are some good examples, like, for example, I Weigh by Jamila Jamil, like, I talked about this before, but I think that's a really good example of like a celebrity actually using their name and their fame to kind of bring more important issues like to a bigger audience, because some of the episodes she brings in fellow celebrities and they talk about really important topics. They talk about body image, you know, they talk about all of these important things. And sometimes she also brings in expert. There was this really brilliant episode I listened to, and it was men's violence against women. And she brought in this professional, Dr. Jackson Katz. And so it was a really compelling episode that talked about a really sensitive topic. And, you know, she was drawing in this really big audience because she had this big name. She was on The Good Place. You know, she's someone who's really like used her status for good. But a lot of times, you know, you kind of see people misusing it, and it'll be a podcast of just, you know, like, let's talk about boys, or let's talk about, you know, social media. And yes, those things are important, but there are a lot of times where, you know, that kind of podcasting is really disconnected from actual news and social justice and furthering important causes. So yeah, I'd say in some ways it's more important than it's important and not important at the same time. Like, there's this really interesting duality to contemporary podcasting, I feel.
No, I totally agree. I feel like a lot of times it's just another way for these big names to slap their name on something and make them a ton more money. Like, use podcasting to make a bunch of more money, and it's not something you're particularly passionate about, but their name's on it. And yeah, so they, you know, get a lot of revenue.
It's the famous people where, you know, they become famous and but they don't necessarily have any talent. So they're kind of like, well, I'm going to find a talent. Like, I'm famous now. Okay, well, I'm going to make a podcast. Or there's all these, whenever there's a reality star and they're like, okay, I'm going to start singing. And they've never sung before in their lives.
Yeah, it just feels like a money-making
my
scheme.
talent is...
my
talent is being popular.
Exactly. But they have to pretend it's justified. So they're like, I sing that.
Well, it's funny too, because one of the things that makes me think about, which I hadn't really connected before hearing what y'all just said, is so my oldest brother Jesse is you know, server at Buca de Beppo in California.
I love that restaurant.
And yeah, it's a great restaurant. I do miss it, and it's always great to go there when he's serving. And he's a phenomenal server. He's been doing it for many years. You know, and I actually interviewed him recently for a kind of working people style interview, but in text form. But anyway, like, we were talking about being a server during the pandemic, and kind of going all this back and forth of like, okay, we're open again. Oh wait, now we're delivery only, or now we're open, but you can only serve in the patio, that kind of stuff. So we talked about that. And then like we had this interesting sort of 5-minute aside where he told me about something that I hadn't heard about until that point, but it was these pop-up restaurants that influencers are doing. Where he said, like, we are Buca de Beppo, we are built to be an Italian restaurant, but a lot of restaurants during the pandemic, to kind of, you know, because they were losing a lot of money, and they got some assistance from the government, but like to make up for that lost revenue, what some restaurants did was they kind of partnered with these influencers to form pop-up restaurants. And so he said, like, you know, we basically, these influencers, they don't have their own establishment. They just come up with like a menu and they give those out to like different restaurants. And so we would get orders to make like Mariah Carey's cookies. And we had to like get a separate oven to bake those in. and we separate boxes to pack them in, and DoorDash people would come and pick them up. But I was like, man, like, just like from that to I forget who the other influencers were, but it was like very like Tyga, I think, was one, and like you had like chicken nuggets, and so like these very weird things where it felt like yeah, this is just like a thing to slap your name on, like to get some money from. Like I don't know, maybe they're good, but I kind of doubt that they are. But it just feels like, yeah, just sort of expanding that reach without a whole lot of substance. And I hope that's not where we end up with podcasts, but I can definitely see how that would come about.
Room temperature chicken nuggets.
Yeah.
Killer metaphor.
I think McDonald's did that. They had
the Travis Scott person,
and also BTS. They had the BTS.
Oh my god, yeah.
So it's
what do you mean?
So yeah, there's chain restaurants too. Oh my gosh, and Dunkin' when they had the Charlie drink.
Yeah.
Who can forget about that? Yeah. So no, it definitely feels like that. But there are still, podcasts of substance, and I don't think that those will go away. But there's the not so great ones out there from just like celebrities and influencers.
To be fair, there's always been a lot of shitty podcasts out there. So I guess I don't want to be revisionist about that. I'm sure if you get me and Billy off recording, what's that?
And there's a place for entertainment, right? It doesn't all have to be super heavy, but yeah.
No, yeah. One of my favorite podcasts is, absolutely ridiculous. Like it's nothing of substance. It's called Who Weekly, and it's basically these two host, gosh, I don't even remember their names, but it's just talking about basically like B-list and C-list celebrities, and I think it's just a riot. And so I just listen to that, like, if I don't want to listen to anything intellectual, I instead, I can hear about, oh, well, what's Victoria Beckham's son up to right now? Like it's just it's just so like absurd.
Yeah, I think like you're saying, you gotta have a sort of, I don't know, balanced diet. I think that's one way I've evolved is like, and I kind of touched on this when I spoke to the class, right? Is like, especially when you're starting out, you take it very personally if your show doesn't take off or if people don't share it or people aren't listening. And then when you see the other shows that are getting listened to and getting shared and getting popular and getting write-ups in this or that magazine, you're like, what the hell? Like, why does the 500th show run by 3 white dudes like get another fucking profile? Sorry, I keep swearing, but I can't. I'm begging people just to listen to Workers for one episode, right? So it's very easy to fall into that. But I think the more that I developed as a podcast listener, the more understanding I got, because it's shows like that you just described, Sophie, that basically got me through this pandemic, right? Like just needed like stuff that wasn't super heady and intellectual, but that I could just have on in my pocket while I was shuffling around the house. And they were really a lifesaver, frankly. And so I've become, I think, more understanding about, the different roles that podcasts can serve, the different scratches they can itch, and to stop sort of seeing everything as sort of a zero-sum competition. That being said, I do think that it is still tough to get people to listen to interviews with workers, and so you got to kind of, feels like making people eat their vegetables sometimes. And so I guess part of what we talked about in the class was like, you got to still try to make it listenable, right? You got to try to be a responsible podcast host and keep people's attention, just like if you were writing a novel or acting a play, right? You gotta earn people's attention, I guess is the way that I would put it. And I think like, gosh, I could talk to you guys for hours, but I know that we're already kind of running up on time here, and that kind of leads us perfectly into the question that I wanted to sort of round us out on, which is like, what value do you think podcasting can still have, or like has not yet realized, like either in your own personal life, like what do you find important or entertaining or redeeming in podcasts, or what do you find important about podcasting as a medium that you want to kind of contribute to as a creator? I don't know. I guess I think a lot, both as the host of Working People and now as editor-in-chief at The Real News, like, you don't just put these things out unthinkingly, right? You gotta, if it's going to be a video, it has to have certain qualities that make it watchable, right? If it's going to be audio, same thing, something that people are going to have keep their headphones on for. So I'm just, like constantly wondering, about how we can harness the different affordances of different media to kind of, speak about important topics, reach different audiences, bring people together in ways that they might not come together, like in other areas of their lives. So that's kind of where I wanted us to end up. But I guess if you guys had any like burning questions that you wanted to toss my way, we can do that. But again, I feel like I talked plenty to the class. But what do you guys think? Do you have any thoughts on kind of what value podcasting can still have in the 21st century media ecology that we're all in?
Yeah, I think definitely like one of the greatest values of podcasting, just as a medium and as a practice, is really the accessibility of it all. Because I feel like, yes, there's a lot that goes into podcast, but more so than, text or film or video, there's sometimes like barriers between that, but it really feels like pretty much like anyone who has enough like drive and passion about something, you can produce a podcast. Like it's relatively easy and cheap to produce, and it's also very easy to consume that kind of media. And so I think it's really important because, people from all walks of life can make podcasts. I know so many high schoolers who have them, and I know so many people who have them. And I think it's really important that, if you just have an idea and you set your mind to it, you can make it. And it's also really easy to, listen to podcasts. Like I know at the very beginning of the pandemic, when everything was shut down, I would just go on like very, very long walks around my neighborhood and just listen to any kind of podcast. So it's something that's relatively easy to consume and then also produce. And so I think that's part of the value and the power of podcasting.
For me, I personally like podcasting as a form of education. And I really like podcasting as a place for like academia and intellectuals. And just education in general. Because I have a really hard time when I'm trying to learn about something to like research online and, read through a bunch of articles. And just sometimes when I'm reading something, this might be just a personal thing though, I'm definitely like an auditory learner. So when I'm reading something, I like read a paragraph and I have to read it again and then read it again and then read it again to like actually, have it sink in. And it feels like work for me. But then when I'm listening to a podcast, like I feel like I'm being productive and educating myself. And I literally am maybe just like going for a run or like doing my laundry or vacuuming. But I'm also learning about like the history of like the Black Panthers or, just something of the sort, or like working people in America. And I'm like, wow, okay, so I'm really productive. And it's just like, I don't know, wow, okay, I'm really productive. But I just like it as a place for like education and just like accessible education. And like because sometimes it can be hard to go through a bunch of articles and find like scholarly articles or peer-reviewed articles and, reliable sources. But I don't know. I feel like podcasts sometimes can be an easier way to find reliable information. I don't know if that's, makes a lot of sense, but it's just an easier way for me to learn.
I can offer my 2 cents here too. I mean, I hope so. I think so. I think as Sophie and Sophia were talking, I was thinking a lot about the experience that I've had and maybe you've had and listeners may have had of like finding a new podcast or finding a podcast for the first time and discovering that you really like it, one, but then number two, there's a huge back catalog. It just feels really like there's so much, like they're talking about something I'm interested in and they're doing it in a way that's compelling, whether that's, social justice related or not, but then to have like a big archive there to just sort of explore and listen to as you multitask and do other things. And so I think like there's, in terms of like audience and potential future audiences and audience engagement with podcasts, I think that I've kind of come to think a lot about, futurity and future audiences and think about the work that I do in Money on the Left as and alongside, my co-hosts and the people that I work with, Scott Ferguson and Max Seho, we're building an archive of interesting conversations about a topic that we find compelling. In our case, the role of public money in making nice things possible for us as, people who live in and care about the world. I know that there was an early episode of Working People that I think you referenced in our earlier conversation, maybe in a roundabout way, but there's a 3-hour episode where you're talking to people who've left academia. So powerful, so long, but so necessarily long, I think. And to have that just there waiting for me to find it 2 years later is a beautiful thing. And I really appreciate everybody who contributed to that episode and to subsequent episodes, of course. But that experience of kind of finding something that has been, whether crafted by people who are masters of audio production or people who are just doing it on their phones, talking about accessibility, they're doing it presumably for a reason, and then it's out there to be discovered and engaged with, sort of in perpetuity, at least as long as the internet's a thing, which is a scary thing at the same time as it's also pretty exciting. And so especially when with Money on the Left, having conversations about money from a left perspective, right, is conversations that me and my colleagues were interested in having, and found that other people through the podcast reaching out to talk to new people in different disciplines about their engagement with money from a kind of like progressive or affirmative perspective. You build community too, and I think that's something that maybe I would ask you, taking on the interviewer hat here at the end, Max, if you could comment on, because listening to that 6-hour live stream, there's a hell of a community that you've built through and around Working People, and I wonder if you might reflect on or comment on the community building potential of podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I just second, everything that y'all said. I mean, I feel the same way about each of the points that y'all made, right? Sophia, I was surprised to actually find how receptive my brain was to stuff that I was listening to compared, as more of a reading person. I think that was one of the things that was very exhilarating about podcasts, was like, wow, I'm actually not only like hearing and learning a lot, but I'm retaining it. Like I would be, it would be rattling around in my brain for days and weeks, as opposed to something that just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. And so that was very exciting for me as well. And, I think like in terms of the accessibility part of it that y'all were mentioning, that's one of the things that I always try to kind of keep in perspective when I think about where we are now, end of 2021, heading into 2022, very uncertain sort of future, very different world than when I was a freshman in college in 2005, 2006. And I think about just how much that sort of accessibility, that landscape of accessibility made possible through social media and through mediums like podcasting and stuff, like that's kind of basically all happened in that span from when I was an undergrad to now when you're all undergrads, right? And even before that, I promise I have a point here, right? Because it influences our politics. It influences the way, like the people that we meet, the friends that we have, right? Because obviously before social media, right, your friends are the people that you meet in IRL, right? You're kind of, there's a lot there to recommend that type of friendship. But now through podcasting and through, a lot of the things that I've done because of the podcast, I've made lifelong friends. I've met so many people around the country and around the world who I feel more closely connected to than like most people I grew up around, right? I mean, case in point, we're here having, a 4-way conversation on different parts of the country about podcasting, right? That never would have happened without, taking that first step of starting a podcast years ago. That's really new and really interesting, right? In the early, like, the days of my youth when growing up in like the 90s, right? The example I always think of is the thing I wanted more than anything. And this is going to sound like gibberish to Sophie and Sophia, but like I used to love watching Nickelodeon. And they used to do this thing where they would come to your school and decorate your school like in all Nickelodeon stuff, and they would like have characters come to your school, and they had the green gack that they like your principal would get doused in that shit. Like I wanted that more than anything as a kid, and the only way that I had to try to get it was to like write a physical letter to like the Orlando studio and send it. Obviously, we never got picked, but you would then see on the Nickelodeon channel the people who did get picked, and you would envy them. But like the point being is that it was all so far away, and you had so little access to it. That the speed at which that has changed is still kind of mind blowing to me, and I think you could tell a lot about our world if you focus on that sort of thing, right? Because politicians now are obsessed with talking about cancel culture because they are more accessible to the public than they've ever been, and they don't like it, right? They don't like having people yell at them on Twitter when, back in the 90s and even early 2000s, you didn't have to deal with, people you didn't want to, right? And that's, again, that's a really rapid change in the ways that society is organized. That I think is still having a lot of really interesting ripple effects in our lives. Same thing goes with, I remember going to undergrad at the University of Chicago. That was right at the period where Facebook had like expanded to a couple of different universities. God, I'm sounding old as shit right now. But, it was like the Ivy Leagues, U Chicago, a couple of other places. So it was like as soon as you got your University of Chicago email, that's when you could register. And it was very exciting because that was like, you had MySpace before that. Then you got to Facebook, which was like the college version. And it was weird because it was my first example. It was my first time ever experiencing the kind of influencer or proto-influencer, right? Because everyone in the incoming class was adding everyone as friends. And naturally, there were like 2 or 3 people who just got all the friends, and like everyone was drawn to, and kind of everyone would like their posts and stuff like that. And I remember that weird feeling of going to campus for the fall semester and seeing one of them and feeling like I was seeing a celebrity, like feeling the way I did being, living in Southern California when I saw like Ice Cube down the street or Lawrence Fishburne or stuff like that. It was weird to be feeling that about someone who I was like, well, wait, they're just like me. Like they're just another incoming freshman, right? Like this is a weird thing to handle. But the reason I mention that is just, again, to highlight, how the stuff that we take for granted because we're in the middle of all of this every single day, it is still relatively new. And I do still think that we are adjusting to it in many ways. And I think that, there are pros and cons there because that's right. The reason I brought that up is that in the same way that, regular people can become influencers and kind of draw that sort of social power, or people, on their phones can actually elicit a response from the rich and powerful in a way that we couldn't for most of human history. Right. There are openings there that we can use to our advantage if we are conscientious about it, if we're intentional about what we're actually doing, right? And that's what made me think in the first place. I was like, okay, these pathways are open now. Maybe I can use them for good. Maybe I can get, like that sort of, reach to the point where I could get people to listen to workers' voices when they don't normally have to do that, right? And in the process, I mean, it's all a product, I guess, of the 21st century affordances of digital media, right? Even most of the workers that I've connected to in the first place, I've connected to through social media, or I'll read an article and I'll follow up and I'll reach out to the author, or, I'll reach out to a union and say like, hey, I read this about this member. Could you put me in touch with them? Like, there are a lot of ways that it's a lot easier now to make those sorts of connections, and people can find the catalog. Like you were saying, Billy, they can listen to them and be like, okay, this guy's not an asshole. Hopefully they think that, or, like this is a show that I'm willing to go on. And it does kind of build in that sort of way. And I guess to kind of close this sort of rant out, the community building aspect, I think, has always been really important to me. And it's something that I constantly want to do more, to build. Right. Because I would always, even in the early days of the show, I would always say I would say we instead of I when I would record the introductions. Right. And that wasn't, that wasn't because I was trying to kind of, put on airs, but it was because, especially in the early days, a lot of the connections to different workers that I made came from friends and comrades who put me in touch with them. And the people who would kind of write in to share their thoughts, I would try to incorporate, their thoughts and criticisms into improving the show. So it's always felt like a collective project, to say nothing of the bare fact that every episode is named after a different person, and the catalog itself in a way represents kind of this ever growing, kind of community of connected people. Even if we're not kind of talking to each other every day and are best friends, right? People listening to someone's story on my show, makes them more connected to that person than, most of us are to anyone else, right? Because we don't know these things about each other. We don't know these details about each other's lives. So even if you just get that hour and a half of listening to someone tell their story intimately, I'm not going to say that in itself is community, but it does, I guess, remind you that there's a whole lot more that we have to do to be in community with each other, that we have to listen to one another, and that there's so much we have to learn from one another, and so many great things that we can actually do together if we are working on collective projects like these. And I think that you're right, Billy, that all really culminated in this live stream fundraiser for striking Kellogg's workers and their families, right? I mean, we kind of put that together in a matter of weeks. We used our different respective kind of connections. We blasted out to our respective followings, and then friends and comrades did the same. And again, it just kind of snowballed into this beautiful moment of 6 hours where, like I said, you had people from all over the states listening and watching in. You had my boy David Story from Alabama doing the production, and David and I have actually never met in person, but I love that guy to death. But he did a 6-hour live stream, volunteered to do it because he thought it was important on a Friday night the week before Christmas, right? So we did that, and people all over were listening and watching and writing in the chat and donating. At the same time that we were literally putting people in conversation, who were standing on the picket line in Omaha and, striking graduate student workers at Columbia University were there, right? Hayden Wright from Alabama and the coal miner strike was calling in from her phone from the strike pantry there. Just again, the media that we have available to us can be used for those ends, right? But we have to kind of realize that in our day-to-day lives, social media, our phones, our computers, they push us in different ways, right? They push us to not be that together, right? And to not kind of forge those bonds of solidarity in meaningful ways. We actually have to kind of see that it's possible to do that with these media, but we have to actually use them intentionally. And I do think that podcasting, if used effectively and marketed effectively, right, there are a lot of pretty radical and beautiful things that we can do with this medium. And I guess I'm just my final word would be is that I'm honored to be doing that work with all of y'all, and I can't wait to see what comes of these great projects.
Same here. Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
Thank you.